The cold wind sliced through the streets of Chicago like a blade, and Al Capone's boots hit the cracked sidewalk with a rhythm that didn't need to announce him. There was a power in the way he walked, smooth, deliberate, his breath fogging in the sharp air. He was holding a worn briefcase, the kind that had seen better days, but it wasn't the case that held his attention. It was what was inside. $347. That's all he had, but today it would be more than enough. Capone wasn't just here for a loan. This wasn't about getting a little bit of capital. He was here to remind people, to remind one man in particular, Harold Pinkert, that nobody ever stays at the bottom forever. He was here for the humiliation, the rage that had been brewing inside him for 6 years since the last time he'd stepped foot in this bank. 6 years ago, Capone had walked into the Pinkert State Bank with nothing but a dream and the hope that a man like him could rise above the gutter. He had asked for a loan, just $2,000, to invest in a failing speakeasy. All he needed was someone to believe in him. But Pinkert, the smug bank manager, had called him a bum, told him he was nobody, a street thug who would never amount to anything. Today, Capone wasn't asking for money. Today, Capone was the one who had it all. And Harold Pinkert was about to find out just how wrong he had been. Capone walked through the bank's front doors. The familiar scent of cigar smoke and polished wood hit him, the smell of power and respect that Capone had once thought was out of his reach. He wasn't here to play nice. The game had changed, and he was running it now. He walked past the tellers, his steps steady and sure, like the world was his to take. The young woman behind the counter looked up, recognized him instantly. Her eyes widened. She wasn't stupid. She knew who Capone was, knew who he'd become. She didn't even ask him to wait. She went straight to the back to get Pinkert. When Capone walked into Harold Pinkert's office, the silence was suffocating. The old man was behind his massive mahogany desk, looking every bit the part of a man who had spent his life in the business of rejecting men like Capone. The same desk, the same leather chair, the same smell of money and power, but everything was different now. Capone wasn't the man who had been humiliated 6 years ago. He had changed. "Mr. Pinkert," Capone said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel, "I'm here to talk business." Pinkert, sitting behind his desk, didn't stand. His eyes narrowed, taking in Capone's expensive suit, his calm demeanor. But he could still see the scarred face, the marks of the streets, the same man who had walked in here before. "What business could you possibly be involved in, Mr. Capone?" Pinkert sneered. Capone's lip twitched, but he didn't let the insult show. This wasn't about his past. This was about the future. The future that had arrived in the form of the $347 he had brought in the briefcase. No longer his life savings, but his ticket to something much bigger. "I'm here to buy your bank," Capone said, as if he were offering to buy a house, not a financial institution. His voice was cool, precise. Pinkert blinked. He didn't laugh, but the disbelief was written all over his face. "My bank," he scoffed. "You're a criminal, Capone. You're nobody. This is ridiculous." Capone stepped closer, the briefcase still in his hand. His gaze never wavered. "Funny how you said I was nobody. I remember you calling me a bum, Pinkert. I remember it like it was yesterday. A nobody who came from the gutter. That's what you said. You told me to come back when I became somebody." Pinkert shifted in his chair, his face flushed. The words, 6 years old, were still fresh in his mind. He could feel the sweat on his brow. He wanted to tell Capone to leave, to call the police, to stop the madness, but he knew deep down there was no power in his voice anymore. Capone had it. He had everything now. "You were wrong about me, Mr. Pinkert," Capone continued, his voice low, but each word slicing through the silence. "I'm not a nobody. I'm not a bum. I'm the man who's going to own your bank." Capone's eyes didn't leave Pinkert's. Pinkert, to his credit, tried to muster some resistance, but his words were empty. "You can't just waltz in here and take what's mine," he said, his voice shaking. "This is illegal. You're a criminal. You can't just buy my bank." Capone leaned in, his face inches from Pinkert's. "What's illegal is thinking you could walk all over me. What's illegal is the way you treated me like I was worthless. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what happens when you bet against the wrong guy." Pinkert was about to speak, but Capone held up a hand, stopping him. "I'm not here for your regulations, Pinkert," he said quietly. "I'm here to make you understand. I'm not just somebody now. I'm somebody who's about to own everything you've worked for." The moment hung in the air, thick with power and threat. Pinkert didn't know what to do. His entire world, built on privilege and disdain for men like Capone, was crashing down around him. And then Capone smiled, a cold, dangerous smile that made Pinkert's heart race. "You've got a choice, Mr. Pinkert," Capone said, his voice dead calm. "You can accept my offer or you can refuse it, but I'm not leaving here without you understanding who I am. I'm the man who makes you regret every word you said to me. Now, you decide." The seconds stretched like minutes. Pinkert's hand hovered over the desk, unsure whether to pick up the phone, call security, or throw Capone out, but his eyes flickered toward the door. The sight of Capone's bodyguards, standing silent and menacing, made the decision for him. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. Capone was in control. He wasn't the boy who had walked in here in 1925, desperate and humiliated. No, the man standing before Pinkert was someone who had built an empire from the dirt, someone who had learned the art of power, and who understood how to bend people and institutions to his will. Pinkert might have had the bank, the reputation, and the old money, but Capone had something more, something far more dangerous. Pinkert wiped his brow with the back of his hand, his mouth dry. He opened his mouth to speak, but Capone's calm demeanor froze him in place. The gangster wasn't in a hurry. He didn't need to rush this. He was playing a game Pinkert couldn't even see. I don't understand," Pinkert muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, desperate for an escape. "You can't buy this bank. There are laws, there are regulations." Capone's lips curled into a tight smile, and his voice dropped to a low murmur. "Regulations," he repeated, letting the word hang in the air like a loaded gun. "I don't need to follow your laws, Pinkert. Not when I've got more money than you'll ever see in your life." Pinkert shifted in his chair, his thoughts scattered. His mind raced through every possible scenario, every angle, but nothing came close to making sense. A criminal, a known gangster, was offering him $10 million in cash, the kind of money that could change everything. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about power. Capone wasn't offering to buy a bank. He was offering to humiliate Pinkert in the most personal, brutal way possible. Capone wasn't here to just take over. He was here to make Pinkert regret the moment he called him a nobody. He was here for revenge. Pinkert's gut twisted as the realization sank in. He looked down at the stacks of money on his desk, the crisp bills arranged neatly in their briefcases. The numbers swam before his eyes. $10 million in cold, hard cash, sitting on his desk like a pile of treasure, ready to be claimed. For a moment, Pinkert wondered if this was all a dream. But it was. This was real. This was Capone's world now, and Pinkert was just a pawn. He tried to gather his thoughts, tried to cling to some shred of control, but it slipped through his fingers like sand. You can't just waltz in here, break every rule, and expect to get away with it. There's a process. There's paperwork. Capone's eyes hardened, his expression colder than ever. He took a step closer, looming over Pinkert's desk. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice a quiet threat. "You're not in charge here anymore. You're not the one making decisions. You're the one who rejected me, and now I'm the one who controls everything." Pinkert could feel the sweat trickling down his back. He glanced nervously at the phone, but even if he called the police, Capone had already won. The message was clear. Capone was a force that could not be stopped, not by Pinkert, not by anyone. "Look at you," Capone continued, his voice laced with contempt. "You're sitting there, surrounded by your fancy bank, your expensive suits, thinking you're in charge, but you're not. You never were. And now, I'm going to show you just how wrong you were about me." Pinkert's throat went dry. The humiliation of it all was suffocating. Capone's calm demeanor, his quiet menace, it made Pinkert feel smaller, weaker, like a man on the verge of losing everything. The moment that Capone had been waiting for, the moment of revenge, had arrived. Capone reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick cigar. He lit it slowly, taking his time as he watched Pinkert squirm. He exhaled a puff of smoke, the action almost ceremonial. The power dynamic had shifted, and Capone was enjoying every second of it. "I'll give you a choice, Mr. Pinkert," Capone said, letting the smoke swirl around him. "You can accept my offer, take my $10 million and walk away with more money than you've ever dreamed of. Or," he paused, letting the silence stretch before adding, "you can refuse. You can send me on my way and spend the rest of your life wondering if you made the right choice." Pinkert opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was trapped and he knew it. He had no way out. The world he had built was crumbling in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Capone's gaze never wavered, his face calm but his eyes burning with the quiet fury of a man who had been wronged. The same man who had come from the gutter, the same man who had been told he would never amount to anything, was now the one holding all the cards. "You've got 5 seconds to decide," Capone said, the words like a ticking clock in the stillness of the room. Pinkert's hand hovered over the phone, but before he could make a move, Capone's men stepped forward, blocking his way. They didn't need to say a word. The message was clear: apologies for the confusion and thank you for your patience. Let's continue from where we left off. The seconds felt like hours. Harold Pinkert's mind raced, but his body refused to follow. The money, $10 million in cash, sitting on his desk, seemed like a cruel joke. A bribe, a slap in the face, an offer he couldn't possibly accept. But the pressure was suffocating. Al Capone stood before him, a man who had made his fortune through the very thing Pinkert had spent his life pretending didn't exist. The hypocrisy of it stung, but more than that, the realization hit Pinkert harder than anything else. He had underestimated the man in front of him, and now that mistake was going to cost him everything. Capone, standing calm and collected, stared down at Pinkert. His presence was overwhelming, a quiet storm that felt like it was about to sweep away everything in its path. He wasn't asking for anything anymore. He was taking control, forcing Pinkert to make a choice he never thought he'd have to face. Pinkert's mouth felt dry as he tried to swallow the lump in his throat. His fingers brushed against the phone, but it felt like a lifeline that was too far out of reach. What would happen if he called the police? What could they do? Against Capone and his army, it was nothing but a futile gesture. Capone had played this moment perfectly. He'd created an atmosphere where no one would dare defy him. Capone watched him struggle, not out of cruelty but out of pure strategy. He wanted Pinkert to feel the weight of every second. He wanted Pinkert to understand that this moment wasn't just about the money. It was about power. The kind of power Capone had built, piece by piece, out of nothing. The kind of power that would make any banker, any politician, any police officer bend the knee. "You're not gonna call the cops, Harold," Capone said, his tone so calm, so precise. "You're not gonna do anything except watch as I take what's mine. I'm giving you a chance to walk away with your dignity if you still have any left. You say yes, you walk away with $10 million. You say no, and I walk out. And when I walk out, your bank, your reputation, it's gone. Because I'm not just buying your bank. I'm buying everything you stand for." Pinkert's heart thudded in his chest. The choice was clear. He could take the money, secure his future, and live with the shame. Or he could refuse, risk it all, and face the wrath of Capone. But that wasn't even the hardest part. The hardest part was the realization that Capone's revenge wasn't just about owning the bank. It was about forcing Pinkert to acknowledge just how wrong he had been. To watch him crumble, to watch him admit that a nobody had become the one man capable of destroying everything he had built. Capone's men stood quietly, their presence a reminder of just how much weight Capone carried in that moment. He had taken everything from Pinkert, his authority, his security, his control. And now, with the final move, he was going to take what was most valuable, his pride. 5 seconds, Capone said again, his voice a quiet command. "You want to sign or not?" Pinkert's hands shook as he looked down at the contract that lay on his desk, the legalities of it swimming in his head. He could say no, he could refuse, but he knew deep down it wouldn't make a difference. Capone had already won. All he had to do was sign his name and the transaction would be complete. With a trembling hand, Pinkert picked up the pen. He looked at Capone, his eyes filled with reluctance and disbelief. The man he had dismissed, the man he had belittled, was now the one holding the power. And as he signed the contract, Pinkert knew he was signing away not just his bank, but his entire sense of who he was. Capone watched the pen touch the paper, his expression unchanged. There was no joy in his face, just the cold satisfaction of a man who had achieved exactly what he set out to do, not through violence, not through intimidation, but through the simple, unyielding force of will. The contract was signed. The deal was done. Capone nodded to his men and they began to collect the briefcases filled with money. The transaction had been sealed, but it wasn't the end. No, Capone still had one last piece to deliver. He turned back to Pinkert, who was still sitting, defeated in his chair. "I want you to understand something, Harold," Capone said, his voice steady. "I didn't buy this bank because I needed it. I didn't buy it because I wanted it. I bought it because I wanted you to understand just how wrong you were about me. You called me a bum, a nobody. Well, I'm somebody now, and I don't need your respect, but I'm going to make you remember this day for the rest of your life." Pinkert opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. His pride was shattered, his reputation destroyed, and he could feel it all slipping away. The man he had dismissed as a nobody was now the one who owned everything he held dear. Capone took a slow step back, his gaze never leaving Pinkert's face. "You're welcome," he said quietly, before turning on his heel and walking out of the office. As the door closed behind him, Pinkert sat there, his heart pounding in his chest. The world he had spent a lifetime building had just been reduced to rubble, and all he could do was watch as Capone disappeared into the streets of Chicago, the man who had risen from nothing to take everything. The next few days were a blur of business and preparation for Capone. He had taken what was his by force, not through gunfire or brutal tactics, but through sheer will and the power that only a man who controls millions can possess. The money, the influence, the intimidation, it was all a part of the plan. But Capone wasn't done yet. As his men moved swiftly and quietly, securing more territories and businesses under his control, Capone's thoughts always returned to one thing: the final touch, the one final humiliation that would seal Pinkert's fate. It wasn't enough to simply own the bank. He needed Pinkert to know in the depths of his being that Capone had not only won but had obliterated the very idea of what Pinkert represented. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about proving he was somebody. Capone had created an empire out of nothing, and he wanted the world to see it. He wanted Pinkert to understand that, despite all the walls he'd built around his world of old money, Capone was the one who ruled now. Capone knew how to make an impact. It wasn't through destroying things that mattered. It was through taking things people thought were untouchable. The bank had been one thing. Pinkert's pride, however, now that was something he had to break. Capone made a plan. The bank would stay open for business for now. But everything inside it, every detail, every ledger, every corner of that building would soon bear Capone's mark. It wasn't just about the immediate power. It was about sending a message to Pinkert, to the city, to anyone who would ever underestimate a man like Capone again. That next morning, Capone sent for his men. "Fix it," he said, his voice calm, low, yet carrying a weight that made them jump to action. "Everything's going to be different, and I want Harold to see it every day. He'll know what I did, what I control, and what he'll never have again." The men moved through the corridors of the Pinkert State Bank. They didn't need to speak. The plan had already been laid out. The changes would be subtle at first, small shifts in the bank's routine that only those who knew the inner workings would understand. But they would be enough to mark Capone's ownership. It wasn't just about the money being poured into the vaults. It was about establishing a presence, taking over the very essence of what Pinkert's empire had been built on. "I understand now, and I'll continue right away." The days that followed Capone's visit were tense, not just for Harold Pinkert, but for everyone who worked at the Pinkert State Bank. The changes, though subtle, began to ripple through the establishment like a stone dropped into a still pond. It wasn't just the obvious things, the new faces that occasionally wandered the halls or the change in the tone of the employees when they spoke. No, it was the feeling in the air, the way the atmosphere in the bank shifted, like a storm cloud hovering overhead, ready to break. Pinkert was being suffocated, piece by piece, by the weight of his own failures, and Capone was in full control. But Pinkert still hadn't accepted the inevitable. He still hadn't come to terms with the fact that Capone was running the show now. That night, when the last of the staff had left, Pinkert stayed in his office, staring out the window at the empty street below, trying to make sense of it all. The phone rang. Pinkert's eyes darted toward the receiver. He didn't want to answer, but something told him he had no choice. He picked it up, his hand shaking as he did. "Mr. Pinkert," a calm voice said on the other end. "It's Capone. I think we need to talk." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no anger in Capone's voice, no threats. Just calm authority, the kind of power that comes from knowing there is no one left who can challenge you. Capone continued. "I know you've been thinking about this, Harold. I've given you some time to think it over, but the time for decisions is here. I think it's time we wrap things up." Pinkert swallowed hard, his pulse racing. "What do you want from me, Capone?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to understand something, Harold," Capone replied. "It's not just about the money, it's about respect. You didn't respect me 6 years ago. You didn't think a man like me could rise to the top. Well, look at me now. I'm at the top and you're just in my way." Pinkert felt a wave of humiliation wash over him. The man he had once dismissed had become the thing he had feared most. A man who could destroy everything he held dear, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "I've made my offer," Capone continued. "Take it or leave it. But don't make me come back here again. If I have to return, it won't be pretty. Trust me." The line went dead. Pinkert sat back in his chair, his hands cold and clammy. The power had shifted so completely, so silently, that he hadn't even realized it until it was too late. Capone wasn't just about to own his bank. He had already claimed it. And now, Harold Pinkert had nothing left to do but accept his defeat. Understood. I will continue the story now. The days dragged on for Harold Pinkert. Each passing hour, he found himself caught in the grip of an ever-tightening vice. The weight of Capone's power hung over him like a shadow, unshakable, suffocating. Every decision he made was clouded by the knowledge that he was no longer in control. Not of the bank, not of his life, not of anything. Capone had placed his men in strategic positions, inside the bank, outside it, watching from the shadows. They were the eyes and ears of the empire that now stretched into every corner of Pinkert's world. Each move Pinkert made was being watched, and even in the privacy of his office, he couldn't escape the presence of Capone's influence. But what hit hardest wasn't the constant surveillance or the quiet threats that lingered in the air. No, what cut deeper was the relentless truth he had to face every single day. Al Capone wasn't just a man who had risen from nothing. He was a man who had made everything around him bend to his will. And Pinkert had once thought he was untouchable. Pinkert sat at his desk, staring at the papers in front of him. His fingers trembled as he picked up the pen. He had tried everything: lawyers, calls to the authorities, even desperate attempts to rally the community against Capone, but nothing worked. Nothing could stop the avalanche Capone had set in motion. The phone rang again. Pinkert's stomach churned. He knew who it was. He let it ring for a moment, steeling himself for the inevitable. When he finally picked up the receiver, Capone's calm voice was there, as it always was. "I think it's time, Harold," Capone said. "Time for you to make a decision. You've had your time to think, but I'm done waiting. You're either with me or you're not. If you're not, well, you know what happens then." Pinkert's throat went dry. The words were simple, but they carried an unspoken threat that made his pulse race. There was no choice in Capone's mind. It was either surrender or the consequences would be dire. "I'll do whatever it takes," Pinkert said, his voice shaky. He hated how weak he sounded, but there was no other option. Capone had already broken him. The bank, his reputation, his pride, everything was gone. "Good," Capone replied, a cold satisfaction in his voice. "I knew you'd come around. Now let's get this over with. I'll be by tomorrow to finalize things. You'll make sure everything's in place, won't you?" "Yes, yes, of course," Pinkert stammered. He was already planning how to make the necessary arrangements, how to ensure Capone got what he wanted. "I'll be expecting you to keep your word, Harold," Capone said before hanging up. "Don't disappoint me." The line went dead and Pinkert sat there, paralyzed by the weight of what had just happened. The final move was in Capone's hands now, and for the first time in years, Pinkert felt truly powerless. He wasn't a businessman anymore. He wasn't a pillar of the community. He was just a man waiting to be crushed under the weight of a world he thought he controlled. "Got it. I'll continue from where we left off." The next morning, Capone's men were already in place, moving quickly and efficiently. Harold Pinkert was in his office, eyes darting around nervously, trying to focus on the papers in front of him. But there was no escaping the feeling that everything was slipping through his fingers. The phone call the day before had sealed his fate. It was no longer a matter of choice. Al Capone had already won. When Capone's convoy rolled up to the front of the bank, the air seemed to freeze. The sound of the Cadillac engines cut through the quiet morning like a warning bell. Capone didn't need to walk in with guns drawn. His presence alone was enough to make the world stop. Pinkert heard the footsteps approaching before the door opened. Capone walked in, his usual calm demeanor in place, but today there was something more, something deeper. It wasn't just about the bank anymore. It was about the complete and utter domination of a man who had once been dismissed as nothing. Capone didn't look around the room. He didn't need to. Everything was already in place. His eyes locked on Pinkert, sitting behind his desk, trying to look confident but failing. "Morning, Harold," Capone said, his voice smooth but commanding. "How are we today?" Pinkert swallowed hard, barely managing to keep his voice steady. I've done what you asked. Everything's ready. The documents are in order." Capone nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't need the details, he already knew. "Good," he said. "I knew you'd come around. I told you this was always going to be how it ended." Pinkert felt the weight of the words. He had been fighting this for so long, but in the end he had been helpless. He had been forced to surrender to Capone's power, to admit that the gangster had done what no one ever thought possible. Capone stood still, watching him for a moment longer before sitting down across from him. "Here's the thing, Harold. I don't need this bank. I have enough money, enough power. I'm not interested in running your little operation, but what I want, what I've always wanted, is to show you that I was never a nobody. You told me I'd die in the gutter. Well, look at me now." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Capone wasn't just claiming victory, he was rubbing Pinkert's face in it, making him understand the depth of his mistake. "You're not the man in control anymore," Capone continued, his voice cold. "And you never will be again." Pinkert felt the floor drop beneath him like he was falling into a pit. He had no way out, no escape. The humiliation was unbearable, but there was nothing left to do but accept it. Al Capone had won and Pinkert had lost everything, his pride, his bank, his position in the world. All of it was gone. Capone stood up slowly, his men following his lead. "I'll have my people take care of the final details," he said. "You're free to go, Harold, but don't think for a second that you'll ever be free of me." With that, Capone turned and walked out of the office, leaving Pinkert behind, a man who had once believed he was untouchable, now reduced to nothing. "Understood. I'll continue with the next part." The days following Capone's visit were a blur of forced normalcy. The Pinkert State Bank, once a proud establishment, now felt like a hollow shell, its former grandeur overshadowed by the weight of what had transpired. Harold Pinkert could feel it every time he walked into the bank, an oppressive silence that hung in the air, thick with defeat. His employees moved with a quiet tension, their eyes never quite meeting his. They knew. They all knew that the man who had once been in charge was now a mere figurehead, a ghost in his own empire. Capone, on the other hand, was everywhere. His influence spread through the city like wildfire, his men in every corner, every street, every backroom. The respect he commanded was unspoken but undeniable. The once untouchable financial institution now bowed to the whims of a criminal empire, and the worst part, it wasn't the fear. It was the realization that the fear had been earned. Capone was the king now, and Pinkert had handed him the crown. At night, Pinkert sat in his office, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the room. His hands trembled as he reached for the phone. It had been days since Capone's visit, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop thinking about what Capone had said, how he had made him feel. He had never once imagined that this man, this criminal, would have the power to bring him to his knees. The phone rang. Pinkert's heart skipped a beat as he picked it up, the familiar dread filling him. He already knew who it was. "Harold," Capone's voice came through the line, calm, almost friendly. "I hope you've had time to think. I know it's a lot to process, but we're going to need to make this official. I'm sending someone over tomorrow to finish the paperwork." Pinkert's stomach turned. I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Capone paused, then spoke again, his tone as smooth as ever. "You've been a good sport about this, Harold. I know it hasn't been easy, but I'm going to make sure you're taken care of. I wouldn't want you to feel like you've been left in the cold." Pinkert gripped the phone tighter, fighting the urge to hang up. What do you want from me now?" he asked, his voice cracked with the weight of surrender. "What I want, Harold, is simple. I want you to remember that this was always going to happen. I'm not a man who forgets, and I'm certainly not a man who gets forgotten." Capone's voice hardened just slightly, the warning clear. "Tomorrow, we make this final. There's no going back after that." The line went dead. Pinkert sat there for a long moment, staring at the receiver in his hand, his mind racing. He had never been in a situation like this, never thought he would be at the mercy of someone like Capone. And yet, here he was, powerless to do anything but comply. Understood. Here's the next part. The following morning was quieter than usual. The street outside the Pinkert State Bank was still, and the usual hum of activity felt distant, as if the world had shifted just slightly out of sync. Harold Pinkert sat at his desk, his hands flat against the wood, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't escape. Capone's words from last night echoed in his head, a constant reminder of the power that now ruled his life. The door to his office creaked open, and he looked up to see one of Capone's men step inside. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, his presence commanding. He didn't speak at first, just stood there for a moment, sizing up Pinkert. Then, with a single motion, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, placing it carefully on the desk. "Capone wants everything settled today," the man said, his voice gruff. "He doesn't like waiting." Pinkert's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to maintain control. The last thing he wanted was to show weakness, but it was becoming harder and harder to hide the truth from himself. There was no more fight left in him. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope. Inside was the signed paperwork, the sale of the Pinkert State Bank to Al Capone, a deal that had been completed without his full consent but with every ounce of coercion Capone could muster. The signature on the page was his own, forced and reluctant. It was official now. Capone owned everything. The man stood silently as Pinkert read through the documents, his gaze never leaving the banker. "Capone's not the kind of man who deals with problems," the man said quietly. "He deals with solutions." Pinkert looked up, trying to steady his breath. He could feel his throat tightening, his chest constricting. His entire career, his entire life had led to this moment, a moment where a criminal had destroyed everything he'd worked for, and there was nothing he could do to change it. The man gave a slight nod as if the matter had been settled. "You've got your instructions. You'll be taken care of, but remember, you're under Capone's protection now. It's not just about money anymore, it's about loyalty, and if you ever step out of line." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. "I understand," Pinkert whispered, his voice breaking as he said it. The man turned and left without another word, leaving Pinkert alone with the weight of his defeat. He sat there for a long time, staring at the papers in front of him, his mind racing with thoughts of what could have been. What had he missed? What could he have done differently? But deep down, he knew there was no going back. The world had changed, and Al Capone had made sure he knew exactly where he stood. Got it? Continuing the story from where we left off. The city of Chicago had always been a place where the powerful and the ruthless played their game. But now, as Capone's empire grew, the very fabric of that city was changing. People whispered on the streets about the man who had risen from the gutters, the man who had done the impossible, beating the system, bending the laws to his will. And yet there were some, like Harold Pinkert, who had learned too late that when a man like Capone makes a promise, it's never about what's written in ink, it's about what's written in power. Pinkert sat at his desk long after his visitor had left, trying to piece together the remnants of his shattered pride. His bank was gone. His control over the institution his family had built was stripped away in a matter of days. The weight of it all pressed down on him like a vice. What had Capone really wanted? It wasn't the money, it was the destruction, the humiliation, the power. As the hours stretched into the afternoon, the phone rang again. Pinkert didn't need to check the caller ID. He already knew. It was Capone. His heart sank into his stomach as he picked up the receiver. "Harold," Capone's voice came through, smooth and controlled. "I trust everything's in order." "Yes," Pinkert answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's all been taken care of." "Good," Capone replied, the satisfaction in his tone unmistakable. "Now I want to remind you about something, Harold. You're under my protection now. You made the right choice, and I don't forget that kind of loyalty." Pinkert felt a surge of bile rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He had no choice but to play along. He knew what would happen if he stepped out of line. Capone's reach was long, and there was no escaping it. "I'll be watching you, Harold," Capone continued, the threat subtle but clear. "You're not going to go back to your old ways. I've made sure of that. Keep your head down and you'll be fine. But try anything funny. Well, let's just say there are worse things than losing a bank." Capone's voice held a finality that made Pinkert's blood run cold. The line went dead, and Pinkert sat there in the silence, a man broken by his own choices. He looked out the window, watching as the city continued its rhythm, people walking by, unaware of the quiet shift in power that had just taken place. For everyone else, life went on. But for him, it was over. He was no longer Harold Pinkert, the owner of the Pinkert State Bank. He was simply another pawn in Capone's vast empire. He reached for the bottle of whiskey on his desk, pouring himself a drink that burned as it went down. He knew he wouldn't find peace in this. But it was the only escape he had left. Understood, continuing the story. The days blurred together for Harold Pinkert, each one a reminder of the life he had lost. Capone's grip on him was suffocating, but Pinkert had learned that survival was about knowing when to bow his head and when to keep his mouth shut. The days of making decisions were over. Now, it was about following orders, about staying out of the way and hoping Capone's eyes would turn elsewhere. Capone, however, didn't leave him alone. His presence was everywhere. Pinkert had to walk with the constant reminder that he was under the watchful eye of a man who controlled not just the city, but everything in it. Capone's men were a constant presence. They made sure the bank ran as smoothly as it ever had, but with an unmistakable shift in power. The money that came in and out, the accounts, the transactions, all of it flowed through Capone's people now. Pinkert was there only for show, a shell of the man he used to be. It wasn't just business. Capone knew how to get under people's skin. He played the long game, every move calculated, every threat hanging just below the surface. Pinkert's phone calls were monitored, his meetings watched. The man who once prided himself on his independence was now a puppet in Capone's hands. One evening, as Pinkert walked home from the bank, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The streets of Chicago were alive, the usual din of traffic and chatter filling the air, but there was an underlying tension. It was the kind of feeling you got when something was coming, something dangerous. The door to his home creaked as Pinkert stepped inside. His wife, tired and worn from the days that stretched into weeks, sat in the dim light of their living room waiting for him. She didn't need to ask about the bank. She already knew. "How long is this going to last, Harold?" she asked quietly, her eyes tired but sharp. "How long before he owns everything?" Pinkert sat down across from her, the weight of the question sinking into him. He wanted to lie. He wanted to say that it would be over soon, that Capone would get bored, that things would return to normal, but he couldn't, not anymore. "I don't know," he said, his voice low, defeated. "But we don't have a choice. He's got everything. The bank, the city, us." His wife's gaze softened for a moment, but then it hardened. "You're just going to let him take it all, then?" Pinkert stared at her, helpless. "What can I do? He's already won." The doorbell rang, cutting through the silence like a knife. Pinkert's heart skipped a beat. It was too late for visitors. Too late for anything to change. He stood up slowly, his legs heavy as he walked to the door. When he opened it, there was no one there, just an envelope slipped neatly through the crack in the door. With trembling hands, Pinkert picked it up, opened it, and found a single note inside. It was short, simple, and unmistakable. "I hope you're enjoying your new position, Harold, but remember, nothing is ever permanent, not even this. You're on borrowed time." The letter fell from his hands, fluttering to the floor. The weight of it hit him like a ton of bricks. Capone wasn't just playing with him. He was toying with his mind, pushing him into submission, making sure he understood that he was never truly free. Capone had him right where he wanted him. Understood, continuing the story. The note Capone had left for Pinkert was more than just a warning. It was a message. A reminder that even though Pinkert had given in, even though he had accepted his fate, there was no escaping Capone's grip. It wasn't just about owning the bank anymore. It was about control, complete control. Pinkert couldn't sleep that night. The walls of his house felt like they were closing in on him. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside seemed like a threat. His mind raced with thoughts of what Capone would do next. He couldn't escape it. The feeling that he was always being watched, always being measured, made every minute stretch longer than the last. The next day, as Pinkert arrived at the bank, he noticed the changes immediately. More men, more eyes. The workers weren't just employees anymore. They were Capone's eyes and ears. Pinkert's role had shifted from bank manager to figurehead, a position he hated but had no choice but to accept. It wasn't just the employees who had changed. The clients, too, seemed different. Whispers filled the air, and Pinkert could feel the unease in the room. The once reputable institution now felt like a pawn shop. Even the people who had come in for routine transactions seemed wary. The clients who had once trusted the Pinkert name now saw it as nothing more than a front for a criminal empire. They could feel the shift. They could feel the power that Capone wielded. One morning, Capone himself walked in, flanked by his usual entourage of bodyguards. His suit was impeccable, sharp, and his presence filled the room. Pinkert stood behind his desk trying to compose himself, but the nerves in his hands betrayed him. "Harold," Capone said with a grin, his voice smooth and unbothered. "I trust everything's running smoothly." Pinkert nodded, barely able to speak. "Yes, Mr. Capone, everything is as it should be." Capone's smile faded slightly, and for a brief moment the air in the room seemed to freeze. "I hope you're not getting any funny ideas, Harold. We're past the point of second-guessing, right?" Pinkert stiffened, trying to mask the fear he felt crawling up his spine. "I've told you I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "I'm loyal. I'll do whatever you need." Capone stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Pinkert's face. "Good, because loyalty isn't something I take lightly. You're mine now, Harold, and I expect you to remember that every day. Don't make me remind you again." Pinkert didn't respond. What could he say? Capone had already won, but he could feel the weight of Capone's words and the power behind them. The threat wasn't subtle. Capone wasn't going to let Pinkert forget who controlled everything. As Capone turned to leave, he paused at the door. "And Harold," he added, his voice cold, "keep in mind the price of disloyalty is steep, very steep." The door clicked shut behind him, and Pinkert slumped into his chair, the breath he had been holding escaping in a heavy sigh. He had no choice but to obey, to stay silent, to keep his head down. His life, his legacy, everything was now dictated by a man who had once been a nobody. Capone had made his point clear. There was no going back now. The game was over, and Capone had won. Understood, continuing the story. The weeks that followed Capone's visit blurred into one long, suffocating haze for Harold Pinkert. He was a prisoner in his own life, shackled not by chains but by fear and submission. Every decision he made at the bank had already been made for him, by Capone. His every movement, every word he spoke was scrutinized. The walls of the bank, once a symbol of his family's legacy, now felt like a tomb. Capone's empire loomed over everything. Pinkert's nights were restless, haunted by dreams of his former life, of control, of respect, of the power he had once held. He had never imagined it would end like this. His own office, once a place where he made decisions that shaped lives, now felt foreign. It was a space where Capone's men watched over him, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. Capone, of course, never stayed away long. He was everywhere, watching, waiting for Pinkert to slip. Every now and then, Capone would drop in unannounced, his presence as commanding as ever. He would walk through the bank with his entourage, eyes scanning everything, looking for weaknesses, looking for opportunities. Pinkert could feel the weight of Capone's gaze on him, every time. On one such visit, Capone sat down in Pinkert's office, his men flanking him on either side. The tension in the room was palpable, the silence suffocating. Capone didn't speak right away, just took his time lighting a cigar as if savoring the moment. Pinkert couldn't sit still. The anxiety gnawed at him. The man who had taken everything from him was sitting across the desk, exuding power in every movement. Pinkert had no choice but to be respectful, but every word felt like a lie in his mouth. "You're doing well, Harold," Capone said eventually, leaning back in his chair. "I like that. You're following orders, that's what I want. It's not hard, right? Just follow the plan and we all stay comfortable." Pinkert nodded, though his insides churned. It wasn't that simple. Nothing about this was comfortable. Capone took a slow drag from his cigar, watching him closely. "I know you're not stupid. You can feel the power shift, can't you? It's a funny thing, isn't it? One day you're on top of the world and the next you're here, running a bank that isn't even yours anymore." Pinkert could feel the sting of those words, like knives twisting into old wounds. But he kept his head down, his hands clenched at his sides. What could he say? What was left to say? "I'm glad we understand each other, Harold," Capone continued, his tone almost conversational. "But I want to make one thing crystal clear. Loyalty goes both ways, and if I ever sense you're stepping out of line, it won't just be your position that's in jeopardy. Understand?" Pinkert swallowed hard, the words hanging in the air, heavy with threat. "Yes, Mr. Capone," he replied quietly. "I understand." Capone smiled, but it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was the smile of a man who knew he had you cornered. "Good, because in my world you're either with me or against me, and the consequences of being against me, well, I'm sure you can guess." The weight of Capone's words settled over the room like a storm cloud, dark and suffocating. Pinkert's mind raced. What was there left for him to do? The man who had once been a pillar of Chicago society was now nothing more than a shadow in Capone's empire. Every ounce of dignity he had left seemed to drain from him with each passing day. Capone stood up, his men following suit. He gave Pinkert one last look, a look that spoke volumes of power, of dominance, and of a future Pinkert could never escape. "I'll be back in a week," Capone said, his voice smooth as glass. "Make sure things stay in order, Harold. I wouldn't want to have to remind you again." And with that, Capone and his men walked out, leaving Pinkert behind, trapped in his own office, alone in the quiet after the storm. Understood, continuing the story. //. The days after Capone's visit stretched into an agonizing haze of silence and tension. Harold Pinkert went through the motions, running the bank, signing papers, overseeing the smallest of operations, but nothing felt real anymore. He was just a figurehead. The decisions weren't his to make, the power wasn't his to wield. Every morning he woke up to the same nightmare. The knowledge that his life, his legacy, had been taken from him by a man who was once considered a nobody. The whispers in the halls of the bank had grown louder, too. Capone's influence was everywhere now. There were no more clients like the ones who had trusted Pinkert's father. They were replaced by men who carried a different kind of power, men who didn't care about old money or reputation. They only cared about what was in their pockets and whether they could make Capone richer. Pinkert's grip on his world had slipped away, piece by piece. He could see it in the way his employees looked at him now, like he was nothing more than an employee himself. They didn't call him Mr. Pinkert anymore. Now it was just Harold, and there was a certain coldness in their tone when they said it. Capone had done more than take his bank. He had taken his identity. It was late in the afternoon when Pinkert finally couldn't take it anymore. He stood up from his desk and walked over to the window, staring out at the city that he had once ruled in his own small way. He had built something here. He had built an empire of sorts, a legacy. But now it was all gone. All because of one decision, one moment of underestimation. A moment when he looked at Al Capone and dismissed him as nothing more than a thug from the streets. But Capone was more than that. Capone was the future, and Pinkert was just a casualty of that future. As he stared out over the city, his thoughts drifted back to the first time he had met Capone, just a kid with a rough exterior and a face full of ambition. He had been nothing back then, a man struggling for scraps, begging for a loan, and Pinkert had sent him away. He had dismissed him, and now Capone had built an empire from that rejection while Pinkert had been left to crumble in the shadow of his success. The phone rang. Pinkert's heart skipped a beat. It was too late for business calls. He reached for the receiver, his fingers trembling. It was Capone, of course. "Harold," Capone's voice came through, as smooth as ever. "You're doing good, I see. Everything's in order." Pinkert could barely breathe. "Yes, Mr. Capone, everything is running smoothly." "Good," Capone said. "But I've been thinking, Harold, it's time to solidify things. You've done well to follow orders, but I need more from you. I need to know you're truly with me. I'm going to need a little more. Cooperation from your end. You understand?" Pinkert felt a lump form in his throat. What do you mean?" Capone's voice turned darker, quieter. "I think it's time we discuss a few adjustments at the bank. Things I need to go down. I'll have a few of my men come by. Just a couple of changes, nothing too major, but I need you to ensure it's done. Immediately. We wouldn't want to have any misunderstandings, would we?" Pinkert's mind spun. Every part of him screamed to refuse, but he knew better. Refusal wasn't an option. The moment Capone had walked into his life, it had been over for him. "I'll make sure it's taken care of," Pinkert said, his voice hollow. He didn't have a choice, he never had. "Good," Capone replied, his tone shifting back to that calm, confident demeanor. "I'll be in touch soon, Harold, don't disappoint me." The line went dead. Pinkert sat there for a long time, staring at the receiver in his hand. His heart was pounding. He had done everything Capone had asked, and yet now he was being pushed further. What did Capone want from him now? What more could he possibly take? The phone call had only confirmed what Pinkert had been trying to deny for so long. Capone wasn't done with him. In fact, Pinkert was just beginning to realize the full extent of his servitude. He wasn't just a figurehead. He was a tool, a puppet, and Capone's grip wasn't going to loosen. "Great. I'll begin the next section with more detail and length, ensuring it's broken down into a comprehensive continuation." The weight of the conversation with Capone lingered long after the phone call ended. Harold Pinkert sat in his office, the walls around him suddenly feeling smaller, more claustrophobic. He had spent years building this institution, watching it grow from his father's legacy into something he had considered untouchable. But now, sitting here, it was clear to him. Everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was nothing more than a shadow of what Al Capone had claimed. The cold truth of the situation settled into Pinkert's bones. He had thought he was a powerful man, someone who had mastered the art of business, someone who had made smart choices, built a legacy that would last. But now he saw it all for what it was, fragile, easily shattered, and not even his to control. Capone had come into his life like a storm, and the aftermath left him broken, unsure of what he could still hold on to. The bank was only the beginning. He could feel it. Capone's reach extended further than just the transactions, further than the business he controlled. It was a reach that dug into the core of everything, into the streets, the back rooms, the politics, and the very air Pinkert breathed. He thought back to the first time he'd rejected Capone, when the young man had walked into this very office with nothing but a briefcase, a few $100s, and the fire of ambition in his eyes. Capone had looked so young then, so raw, and yet Pinkert had dismissed him. He had called him a bum, a nobody. He had seen Capone as just another street thug, too unpolished, too rough around the edges to ever amount to anything. But now, looking out the window of his office, Pinkert saw the truth. Capone had risen from the dirt, had used the very things Pinkert had dismissed him for, his background, his toughness, his willingness to play dirty, and turned them into the tools of his success. Capone had done the impossible. He had climbed to the top, taking everything with him. And now Pinkert was left behind, powerless, trapped by his own arrogance. The thought gnawed at him. Capone wasn't just the man who controlled the bank now. He was the man who controlled everything. Pinkert was a pawn in his game, and there was no escaping it. As the day stretched on, the bank continued to hum with activity, the same way it always had. But Pinkert knew that nothing was the same anymore. The workers moved about their business, but the air felt different, heavy with the unspoken truth that Capone was in charge. He could feel their eyes on him, watching to see what he would do next, waiting for the inevitable moment when Capone's influence would settle completely into place. By the time the sun set, Pinkert was no closer to finding a way out. There was no negotiation, no bargaining left. Capone had made it clear that his control over the bank was absolute. And now, with the threat of Capone's men looming over him, Pinkert could feel the weight of the decision pressing down harder than ever. The ringing of the phone broke his thoughts. He hesitated for a moment before picking it up, knowing who it was before even answering. "Harold," Capone's voice came through, as smooth and as chilling as ever. "It's time to move forward. I trust everything's in order." Pinkert's heart raced. "Yes, Mr. Capone, it's all in place," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, trying to mask the tremor he could feel in his hands. Capone paused as if savoring the moment. "Good, because I've been thinking, Harold. I'm sure you understand how important this is. This bank is my bank now, and I expect you to make sure everything goes smoothly. You've done well so far, but you're not finished yet. There are adjustments we need to make." Pinkert's stomach dropped. "Adjustments," he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. "Exactly," Capone replied, the word hanging in the air. "Nothing major, but we'll need some. Changes to the way things are being run. You'll make sure that happens, won't you, Harold?" Of course," Pinkert stammered. "What exactly do you need me to do?" Capone's tone became more direct, more commanding. "I want to see a change in the way this place operates. I want to make sure that the men who are loyal to me are taken care of. There are a few people I want to place in key positions. You'll take care of that, won't you?" Pinkert's mind raced, but he couldn't refuse. "Yes, Mr. Capone, I'll make the changes." "Good," Capone said. "And Harold, you know better than anyone that loyalty is rewarded. But if you disappoint me, if I ever get the sense that you're trying to undermine me, well." Capone's voice turned colder, like the steel of a blade. "I don't need to remind you what happens then." Pinkert's throat tightened and he swallowed hard. "I understand." "I'll be by tomorrow to check in," Capone continued, his voice returning to its usual calm. "Make sure everything is in place, Harold. I'm counting on you." The line went dead, leaving Pinkert with the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He set the receiver down slowly, staring at it as though it were the source of all his misery. Tomorrow. Capone would be back tomorrow to see how well Pinkert had followed through, and he knew, deep in his bones, that it wasn't about the bank anymore. It was about power. Capone was testing him, seeing how far Pinkert would bend, how far he would go to please him. Pinkert had no choice. The man who had once thought of himself as an unshakable pillar of society was now at the mercy of a man who had no respect for those kinds of ideals. He was a criminal, no better than the people he had once looked down on. And in the world Capone had created, there was no room for anything but obedience. The night stretched on, heavy with anticipation, as Pinkert sat in his office. The weight of Capone's words still lingered in the room like a thick fog. He had spent his entire life climbing the ladder, believing that respect, reputation, and the power of money would shield him from the dangers of the world. But now, he realized how easily that illusion had been shattered. The city outside seemed indifferent to the storm that was raging in his chest. Chicago carried on, cars honked, street vendors shouted, and people went about their business, unaware that one of its pillars, a man who had once been untouchable, was now at the mercy of a gangster. Capone, a man whose name was synonymous with fear and respect, now controlled everything. And Pinkert was nothing more than a pawn in a game he could no longer escape. The clock ticked relentlessly, each passing minute bringing him closer to the moment when Capone would return to finalize his control over the bank. The paper that had once meant power, his signature on those forms, the ownership of the Pinkert State Bank, now felt like a death sentence. It wasn't the same feeling he'd had when he'd first signed the papers, back when he thought he was doing something legitimate. This time, the ink felt like shackles. He stood up, pacing the length of his office. His eyes flickered toward the door that had once been a symbol of his authority, a door that now felt like a barrier keeping him inside his own prison. He couldn't stay in here forever. He had to face Capone. The thought made his stomach churn. Pinkert was no fool. He knew the deal was already done. There was no way out. Capone had made it clear there would be no negotiation, no second chances. Pinkert was just one more man who had failed to understand the power of the world he had been living in. He had dismissed Capone as a nobody, and now the tables had turned. There was a knock at the door. Pinkert froze, his heart racing. He didn't need to open it. He knew who it was, Capone's men. They were here just as Capone had promised. The real weight of the moment hit him then. It wasn't just about the bank. It was about his very existence. He wasn't just losing control of the bank, he was losing control of his life. "Come in," he called, his voice betraying the nerves he felt. The door creaked open, and one of Capone's men stepped inside. The man was tall, with broad shoulders and a cold, calculating expression. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone spoke volumes. "Mr. Capone wants to see you," the man said simply. Pinkert nodded, his throat tight. He could feel the weight of the words on him, a reminder that he was now in Capone's world, not his own. The man led him through the halls of the bank, and as they walked, Pinkert couldn't help but notice the subtle changes. The men stationed at every corner, watching, observing. Capone's presence had seeped into every corner of the building. The once innocent halls of the Pinkert State Bank now felt like a fortress, a place where only those loyal to Capone could exist. There was no room for him in this world anymore. As they reached the elevator, Pinkert's heart pounded in his chest. The silence between him and the man beside him was suffocating. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and Pinkert stepped inside, the man following close behind. When the doors closed, Pinkert's thoughts raced. Was Capone going to kill him? Was this the moment when everything ended? He had seen enough of Capone's cruelty to know that nothing was off limits. Capone had taken everything from him, and now he was going to take the last piece of dignity Pinkert had left. But then he stopped. Capone wasn't a man who acted without purpose. If Capone was going to make an example of him, it would be done on his terms with a clear message. Capone was strategic, methodical. Pinkert was useful to him, at least for now. The elevator reached the top floor, and the doors opened to Capone's private office. It was grand, filled with plush furniture and dark wood accents. Capone stood by the window, his back to Pinkert, looking out over the city. His posture was relaxed, confident. The man who had broken Pinkert now stood in the position of power, not just over him, but over everything. "Harold," Capone said, not turning to face him, "I trust everything's running smoothly." Pinkert stepped inside, his legs feeling like lead. He couldn't find his voice for a moment. All he could do was nod. Capone turned slowly, a smile spreading across his face. "I knew you'd come around, Harold. I knew you'd understand that the world doesn't work the way you thought it did. You had your way. I have mine. And look where we are now." Pinkert could only watch, his hands trembling as Capone's words sank in. You've been a loyal man and I respect loyalty, Capone continued. But now, I need to see if you understand just how far loyalty goes in this world. In my world. Pinkert tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? He had nothing left to offer Capone. His legacy, his pride, his power, all of it had been stripped away. Capone stepped closer to him, his gaze unwavering. Loyalty goes both ways, Harold. I've kept my end of the deal. I've protected you. I've given you everything you need. Now it's time for you to prove your loyalty. You're in my world now. The bank is mine. You are mine. And you will make sure everything runs smoothly. If I'm disappointed, well, you won't have to worry about it. I'll take care of things. Pinkert felt a chill run down his spine. The weight of Capone's words crushed him. There was no escape now. There was only obedience. I've done everything you've asked, Pinkert said, his voice barely above a whisper. Capone's smile grew. Good, but don't think you're finished yet. There's more work to do. You're going to help me clean up the streets of this city. You're going to be my man inside this bank, and you're going to make sure my people are taken care of. I'll be watching, Harold. Every step of the way. Pinkert nodded, the reality of his situation sinking in deeper. Capone wasn't just controlling the bank, he was controlling him, and there was nothing Pinkert could do to stop it. Understood. Continuing the story. The days that followed Capone's visit were an agonizing mix of routine and tension for Harold Pinkert. Each morning, he walked into the bank, his steps slow, heavy with the weight of the promises he had made. He could feel Capone's presence everywhere, as though the very walls of the building had been imbued with the gangster's power. The men Capone had placed around him watched his every move, silent sentinels whose eyes seemed to follow him no matter where he went. Pinkert had become a prisoner of his own bank, a man who no longer controlled the fate of his own empire. The pressure was mounting. Capone had made it clear that Pinkert's loyalty would be tested. He was a tool in Capone's grand scheme now, and the one thing that terrified him more than anything was the thought that Capone would discard him once he was done. Pinkert had seen the way Capone operated. He took what he wanted, and when it was no longer useful, he cast it aside without a second thought. But Pinkert didn't have the luxury of contemplating his fears. Every day, he was reminded of his reality. The employees no longer looked at him with respect. Instead, they saw him for what he had become, a man who had failed to hold onto the very thing he had built. The customers who once came in with trust now eyed him with suspicion. The whispers in the hallways grew louder, and Pinkert could feel them every time he walked through the corridors. It was no longer about the business, it was about survival. He had to navigate Capone's empire carefully, making sure every decision he made aligned with Capone's demands, while also trying to hold onto whatever shred of dignity he could. Capone wasn't just controlling the bank. He was controlling the city. His reach extended far beyond the walls of the institution. Pinkert's every action was now tied to Capone's will. The world that had once been his to shape now belonged to the man who had bent it to his vision. But Capone wasn't just a boss. He was a constant, looming presence in Pinkert's life. A reminder that no matter what Pinkert did, no matter how hard he tried, he would never escape the grip of the man who had taken everything from him. It was late one afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the buildings, casting long shadows over the city when Pinkert's fears were realized. Capone walked in as effortlessly as always, flanked by his usual bodyguards. They were just there to observe, to make sure everything was running smoothly. Pinkert stood up to greet him, but there was no handshake, no acknowledgement of his position. Capone didn't need to extend the courtesy. He was in control now. Harold, Capone said, his voice smooth with a hint of cold amusement. I've been thinking, we need to make sure you're really loyal. I've got a few tasks that'll test your commitment. Don't worry, nothing too difficult, just some small adjustments. Pinkert's heart sank. He knew exactly what that meant. Every small task Capone assigned was another test of loyalty, another moment when he could be discarded if he didn't meet Capone's expectations. Capone leaned in, his eyes narrowing, assessing Pinkert with a cold, calculating gaze. You're a smart man, Harold. I've always admired that. But smart men understand one thing. Loyalty is everything. You stay loyal to me and I'll make sure you're taken care of. You stray even a little and I'll make sure you never see a dime of what you've worked for. Is that clear? Pinkert nodded, unable to form words. The reality of his situation pressed down on him like a weight. There was no escape. Not now, not ever. Capone owned him, owned his life, owned his soul. Good, Capone said, stepping back and straightening his suit. I've got some new people coming in. They're going to help you run things from now on, just a little more. Oversight. We can't be too careful. We need things to stay in line. Capone turned to leave but then stopped, looking back over his shoulder. And Harold, just remember one thing, you're mine now. No going back. So don't make me remind you again. The words echoed in Pinkert's mind long after Capone had walked out. He felt the walls closing in. The finality of Capone's control was absolute. His life, his legacy, his future, everything was in the hands of a man who had no use for anything but his own power. Pinkert knew what Capone's message meant. It wasn't just about the bank anymore. Capone had made his move. He was watching Pinkert, controlling every aspect of his life until there was nothing left but Capone's will. The realization hit Pinkert harder than anything else. He had become nothing more than a servant. A man who had once commanded respect was now subservient to a criminal. And what's worse, he knew he couldn't fight it. He couldn't fight Capone's empire. The night fell and Pinkert sat alone in his office, staring at the papers in front of him. They had once been a symbol of his control, of his power. Now, they were just another reminder of his fall from grace. Every stroke of the pen he made felt like a betrayal to the man he had once been. Every decision he made was a decision that pushed him further into Capone's world, a world where loyalty was demanded, not earned. As Pinkert sat there, the weight of his life sinking in, he realized that nothing would ever be the same. Capone had taken everything from him, and now there was nothing left but obedience. There was no escape, no redemption. He was trapped in a world he could never leave. A world where Al Capone was the only one who mattered, understood, continuing with the story. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of Capone's control grew heavier with each passing moment. Pinkert's life had become a series of calculated movements, each one designed to avoid conflict, maintain order, and stay in Capone's good graces. He was no longer the man who had once managed the Pinkert State Bank with pride. Now he was simply a pawn in Capone's game, doing whatever was asked of him, ensuring that the bank's operations continued to run smoothly under Capone's watchful eye. The men Capone had placed within the bank were always there, always watching, always waiting for any sign of weakness. Pinkert couldn't escape them. They followed him everywhere he went, even into the private areas of the bank where only the highest-ranking officials had once roamed. There was no privacy. There were no secrets. Everything was now known, monitored, and controlled by Capone. The whispers had started long ago. The employees spoke in hushed tones, careful not to upset the balance that had been forced upon them. They had seen it happen. They had witnessed Pinkert's fall from grace. Some felt sympathy for him. Others had long since stopped caring. In Capone's world, sympathy was a luxury no one could afford. Power was everything. And Pinkert had learned that lesson the hard way. It wasn't long before Capone began to make his demands known, even more directly. Each time he entered the bank, it was as though the entire building shifted beneath his feet. His presence alone was enough to send waves of fear through the staff, even the ones who had grown accustomed to him. Capone had no need for subtlety. He demanded loyalty, and in return, he gave nothing but the barest assurance that Pinkert would continue to exist in this carefully controlled world. One day, as Pinkert sat at his desk, his thoughts consumed by the weight of the last few weeks, the door to his office opened without warning. It wasn't the usual men who accompanied Capone. This time, it was a man Pinkert hadn't seen before, tall and lean, his face unreadable. Behind him, Capone himself stepped into the room. Capone was dressed in a custom-tailored suit that exuded wealth and power, the very embodiment of the empire he had built. His smile was calm, but there was something predatory in it, something that Pinkert couldn't quite place. "Harold," Capone said, his voice smooth and easy, "I trust everything is running smoothly." Pinkert's eyes flickered toward the man who had entered with Capone. His presence felt like an unwelcome shadow, lurking behind Capone. It was clear that this man wasn't just here to observe. There was purpose in his movements, purpose that Pinkert couldn't ignore. "Everything is fine, Mr. Capone," Pinkert said, his voice tight but controlled. "Everything is as it should be." Capone smiled, taking a slow step toward the desk. "That's good to hear," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But I want you to know, Harold, that I'm always watching. Every move you make, every decision, it's all under my watchful eye, and I expect nothing less than perfection from you." Pinkert's heart raced. It wasn't a question but an assertion, a reminder that Capone's control was absolute. And just as Pinkert thought he might say something in response, Capone continued. "I've got someone new for you to meet," Capone said, gesturing toward the tall man standing behind him. "This is Tony. Tony's going to be handling a few things around here, making sure things stay organized. I want you to make him feel at home. Show him the ropes, Harold. You're going to be working closely together from now on." Pinkert's mind raced. This wasn't just another one of Capone's men. This was a change, a shift in the way Capone was managing things, and Pinkert had a sinking feeling that it wasn't just about the bank anymore. Tony wasn't here for just oversight. Capone was tightening his grip even further. Tony stepped forward, his expression cold, and extended a hand. "Mr. Pinkert," he said in a voice that was as calm as it was sharp, "I've heard a lot about you. I'm looking forward to working with you." Pinkert stood slowly, forcing himself to maintain composure. He shook Tony's hand, feeling the coldness of the man's grip as though every part of him was a reflection of Capone's iron-fisted rule. There was no escaping it. There was no room for mistakes. "We'll do everything we can to ensure everything runs as it should," Pinkert said, his words feeling hollow in his mouth. Capone nodded, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. "I'm glad we understand each other, Harold. Now I'll leave you two to get acquainted. Remember, Harold, I expect nothing but loyalty from everyone here, you included." Capone turned and walked out of the office, his men following closely behind. The door clicked shut with a finality that echoed through Pinkert's chest. He was alone now, alone with the weight of Capone's words and the realization that his life was no longer his to control. Pinkert sat back down at his desk, staring at Tony, who had taken a seat across from him, his eyes studying Pinkert with cold, clinical precision. The man said nothing, only watching Pinkert as though waiting for the next move. Pinkert cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. "Well, Tony," he said, his voice tight, "what exactly do you want from me?" Tony smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's not about what I want from you, Mr. Pinkert," he said, his voice smooth like oil. "It's about what Capone wants, and right now Capone wants everything to run perfectly. No mistakes, no surprises. If we work together, everything will be just fine." Pinkert's mind spun. The walls of his world were closing in, and the reality of his situation hit him like a wave. He was trapped. He had no way out. Capone had made it clear there would be no rebellion, no defiance. There would be only obedience. And as for Pinkert, he could either follow the rules or face the consequences. The fear of the latter was enough to silence any protest he might have felt. "Understood," Pinkert said finally, his voice hollow. He knew there was no other choice. Tony's role in the bank wasn't just a temporary arrangement. He was Capone's way of ensuring Pinkert's complete submission. Tony stood, his movements deliberate and measured. "Good," he said, his smile never wavering. "I'll be in touch. We'll make sure things go smoothly. Don't worry, Mr. Pinkert, you'll get the hang of it." As Tony left the office, Pinkert was left alone once more, the silence deafening. He could feel the walls closing in around him. Capone had made his mark, and now Pinkert had no choice but to live within that world, to answer to the whims of a man who had taken everything from him. For the first time in his life, Pinkert realized that he was nothing more than a cog in a much larger machine, a machine that was moving faster and faster, and one he had no power to stop. The days bled together for Harold Pinkert as he adjusted to his new, grim reality under Capone's watchful eye. The bank, once a symbol of his family's hard work and prestige, had become little more than a front for Capone's empire, and Pinkert's role in it had shrunk to that of a mere manager. The very building that had once been a pillar of the community was now just another piece in Capone's game of control. Tony, Capone's new enforcer, had become a constant presence in the bank, observing every decision Pinkert made, every meeting he held, and every transaction that passed through his hands. Tony didn't need to say much. His icy demeanor and calculating gaze spoke volumes. Every move Pinkert made was now under scrutiny, and the weight of it felt unbearable. Pinkert had learned quickly that any deviation from Capone's plan would not only result in the loss of his position, but possibly worse. A few small mistakes, a few missed opportunities, and Capone's men would be knocking on his door, ready to remind him just how expendable he truly was. As the days passed, Pinkert's life outside the bank felt increasingly distant. His home, once a sanctuary of warmth, now seemed cold and empty. His wife, though still supportive, could see the changes in him, how his eyes had lost their spark, how his once proud shoulders had slumped. The weight of being Capone's servant was taking its toll, and she couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. One evening, after another long day spent under the watchful eye of Capone's men, Pinkert walked into his home, the familiar creak of the door barely registering in his mind. His wife sat at the kitchen table, the dim light casting shadows on her face. She looked up when he entered, but there was no warmth in her gaze, just concern. "Harold," she said softly, her voice laced with worry, "you've been different lately. I can see it. This isn't you." Pinkert paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. He didn't know how to respond. How could he explain to her that the man she had married, the man who had been proud, strong, and independent, was now just a shadow of his former self? How could he explain that he had no power anymore, no agency, no control over his own fate? "I don't know what you want me to say," he replied, his voice rough. This isn't a choice I made. It's just how things are now." His wife stood up and walked over to him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "Harold, you don't have to accept this. There has to be a way out. You're not a prisoner, not yet." Pinkert shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You don't understand, Evelyn. This isn't something I can just walk away from. Capone owns everything now, my life, my bank, my reputation. There's no escape." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She simply stared at him as if trying to find the man she had once known behind the hollow gaze of the man standing before her. "I can't lose you, Harold," she said quietly. "You've already lost so much, but don't lose yourself. Don't lose who you are." Pinkert closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push back the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He had already lost so much, but to lose himself, to lose the last shred of dignity he had left, was something he couldn't bear. "I don't know who I am anymore," he whispered. The next morning, as Pinkert walked into the bank, he could already feel the tension in the air. The men Capone had placed around him were there, watching him with silent, unreadable eyes. The walls that had once felt like a safe haven now felt like a cage. The bank, which had once been his to command, was now a prison. And the guards at the gates were Capone's men, silent, unyielding, always there. Tony was already waiting for him in his office, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Pinkert," he said, his voice steady, "we need to talk." Pinkert didn't sit. He could. His legs felt weak beneath him as he approached Tony's desk. He could feel the weight of the man's gaze on him, his every move being scrutinized. "I've been keeping an eye on the books," Tony continued, not looking up, "and I've noticed a few discrepancies." Pinkert's stomach dropped. "Discrepancies?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. He knew what Tony was referring to. He had been making small adjustments, trying to keep the bank running smoothly while staying in Capone's good graces. But now it seemed even the smallest mistake could cost him everything. Tony finally looked up, his gaze piercing. "You know what I'm talking about, Harold. The figures aren't adding up. Capone doesn't like mistakes, and neither do I." Pinkert's heart raced. I didn't mean for anything to slip through the cracks. I've been doing everything I can to keep things running smoothly. You have to understand, I'm just trying to stay ahead of Capone's demands." Tony stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Pinkert's face. "I understand, Mr. Pinkert, but Capone doesn't want to hear excuses. He wants results, and if you can't deliver, well, we both know what happens next." The air in the room felt thick with tension. Tony's words hung in the space between them, each one a silent threat. Pinkert could feel his pulse quicken, his thoughts racing. He had no room for error. One wrong move, one small slip, and it would all be over. "I'll fix it," Pinkert said quickly, his voice almost pleading. "I'll go over the numbers again, make sure everything is in order. Just give me a little more time." Tony stared at him for a long moment before nodding, his face still cold. "You have until tomorrow. Capone wants everything sorted by then." As Tony turned and walked out of the office, Pinkert sank into his chair, his hands shaking. The weight of the pressure, of Capone's constant demands, of the fear that gripped him, was becoming unbearable. He had spent so much of his life building something that now lay in ruins. And now, with Tony's threat hanging over him, he could feel the last remnants of his control slipping away. The night stretched on, a bleak silence settling over the Pinkert State Bank. Harold Pinkert sat alone in his office, staring at the ledgers that had been a symbol of his hard-earned success, but now felt like an insurmountable burden. The weight of the papers in front of him was almost too much to bear. Tony had given him a deadline, tomorrow. If Capone's numbers didn't add up, if there was even the slightest hint of a discrepancy, Pinkert knew what the consequences would be. His mind raced as he scanned through the books. The figures, once easy to calculate, now seemed to dance around him, mocking him with their complexity. Each line on the page blurred, the numbers seeming more like enemies than figures of balance. What was once routine was now a perilous game of survival. He poured himself another drink, the whiskey burning as it slid down his throat. He had always found comfort in a drink at the end of a long day, but now even the burn of alcohol didn't provide the same relief. It was as if the taste had lost its flavor, replaced by the bitter sting of fear and guilt. It had only been a few months since Capone had taken over, and yet it felt like an eternity. Pinkert had watched his empire crumble, piece by piece, under the weight of Capone's insatiable hunger for power. But it wasn't just the loss of the bank that had destroyed him. It was the realization that his life had been stolen from him, and there was no way to get it back. He had once prided himself on his intelligence, his ability to navigate the world of business with precision. But now, all of that felt meaningless. Capone had taken it all, turned it into a game, and Pinkert was just another pawn. His every move was dictated by the whims of a man who had no respect for the rules he had lived by. He set the glass down and turned his attention back to the ledgers, but his mind wandered. He thought of his wife, Evelyn. She had been his rock through it all, the one person who had never wavered in her support. But even she could see the changes in him. The fear in her eyes when she looked at him now was something he couldn't ignore. She saw him for what he had become, a man without control, without a future. The sound of the phone ringing snapped him out of his thoughts. He reached for the receiver, his hand trembling as he brought it to his ear. "Mr. Pinkert," came Tony's voice on the other end. "It's time to meet with Capone. He wants the numbers by noon. Don't be late." Pinkert's stomach dropped. He glanced at the clock. It was already past 9:00 p.m. The pressure was suffocating, but he knew there was no turning back now. He had to make sure the numbers added up, whatever it took. "I'll be there," Pinkert said, his voice low and strained. Tony didn't say anything else before hanging up. The line went dead, and Pinkert was left alone in his office once more, the weight of the conversation sinking in. He could feel the tension building in his chest, the anxiety gnawing at him as he prepared for what would come next. The sun had barely begun to rise when Pinkert found himself standing in front of Capone's private office. The air was thick with tension as he stepped inside, greeted by Capone's men, who stood like silent sentinels at the door. Pinkert's eyes darted around the room, but Capone wasn't there yet. He was alone with the men, alone in the very space that had become a symbol of his submission. Minutes passed before Capone finally walked in, his usual calm demeanor masking the power that radiated from him. He didn't need to say a word to command the room. His presence alone was enough to make Pinkert's pulse quicken. Capone walked toward the desk and sat down, motioning for Pinkert to take the seat across from him. "Harold," he said smoothly, "I hope everything's in order. I've been keeping an eye on the numbers and I expect you've done your job." Pinkert nodded, though his heart was racing. "Yes, Mr. Capone. The figures are in order. I've double-checked everything." Capone's gaze never wavered as he studied Pinkert, his eyes calculating. "Good," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You know, Harold, I've been thinking about you, about how far you've come. When I first met you, I never would have guessed you'd be the one holding the reins to my bank. But here we are." Pinkert felt a chill run down his spine. Capone's words were heavy with meaning, and he could see that Capone wasn't just making small talk. There was something more behind those words, a subtle warning perhaps, a reminder that Pinkert's position was only secure as long as he followed the rules. "You've done well," Capone continued. "But we both know that this place isn't just a bank. It's the key to everything. Money talks, Harold. It's all that matters. And if you can't keep the money coming in, well, you'll be out of a job, and I'm sure you know what happens to people who lose their usefulness." Pinkert's throat tightened. The air in the room felt heavy. "I understand," he said, though his voice was barely above a whisper. Capone leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I'm counting on you, Harold. I need this place to run smoothly. Every transaction, every dollar, no mistakes. Do you understand?" Pinkert nodded again, his mind racing. He couldn't afford another slip-up. He couldn't afford failure. Not now, not when Capone had already shown him what happened to those who crossed him. "I've set things up," Capone said, his tone casual but with a quiet menace beneath it. "You'll keep the flow of money coming in. I'll handle the rest. But remember this, loyalty is a two-way street. You keep me happy and I'll keep you comfortable. Step out of line and there won't be anything left for you." Pinkert's hands were clammy, but he kept his composure. "I won't disappoint you, Mr. Capone. I won't." Capone gave him a slow smile, the kind that sent chills down his spine. "I know you won't, Harold, but just in case you forget, I'll remind you." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken threats. Capone didn't need to say more. The message was clear. Pinkert was on borrowed time. The only thing that would keep him alive in Capone's world was his ability to serve. As Capone stood up and left the room, leaving Pinkert with nothing but the weight of his words, Pinkert realized the full extent of his situation. He was trapped in a world where nothing mattered but loyalty, and loyalty meant survival. There was no escaping it now. There was no turning back. The city outside moved in its usual chaotic rhythm, oblivious to the dark undertones that ruled the halls of the Pinkert State Bank. Harold Pinkert stood at the window of his office, staring out at the skyline, but he didn't see the buildings, the cars, or the people below. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the heavy weight of Capone's words. The way Capone had looked at him, the way he had reminded him of his place, it wasn't just a warning. It was a statement of control. Pinkert had once been the one who made decisions, who shaped the course of things. But now, he was nothing more than an instrument of a far greater power, and that realization stung worse than any physical blow ever could. Capone's men were always present, always lurking in the background. Tony, Capone's trusted enforcer, had become a constant shadow in Pinkert's day-to-day operations. Every report Pinkert filed, every transaction he signed off on, Tony was there, his sharp eyes always watching, his silent presence a reminder that Capone's influence was never far. Pinkert's office, once his sanctuary, now felt suffocating. The very air seemed heavy with the weight of Capone's control. There was no escaping it. No matter where he went, no matter how hard he tried to focus on the business side of things, the truth kept gnawing at him. He was no longer the man in charge. He was a servant, a tool to be used until he was no longer useful. The sound of the door opening brought him back to reality. It was Tony, as usual, stepping into the office without a word. Tony didn't need to announce himself. Pinkert had grown used to his presence, and his eyes instinctively flickered to the man. Tony stood there watching him, waiting for something. He was the silent enforcer, always watching, always calculating. "We need to talk," Tony said, his voice calm, yet with an edge that sent a chill through Pinkert. Pinkert didn't respond immediately. His mind was still racing, the weight of the previous conversation with Capone still fresh. He didn't want to deal with Tony. He didn't want to face the reality of his situation, but there was no avoiding it. "About what?" Pinkert finally asked, trying to sound nonchalant, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. Tony stepped forward, his gaze narrowing. "Capone's got more plans for you, Harold. He wants you to clean up some things. There's a situation with some of the other businesses under Capone's control. He's counting on you to handle it." Pinkert's stomach dropped. He didn't need to ask for more details. He knew exactly what Tony meant. Cleaning up meant handling things the way Capone preferred, through intimidation, coercion, and if necessary, violence. "I've handled everything Capone's asked," Pinkert said, trying to maintain control of the conversation. "I've kept everything running smoothly." Tony's eyes darkened. Capone doesn't care about smooth running, he cares about power. And right now, Harold, he's putting his faith in you, but make no mistake, if you slip up, there's no coming back from it. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Tony was giving him a choice, but not really. It was a choice between survival and destruction. The thought that Pinkert could ever go back to his old life, making decisions freely, without fear, seemed like a distant memory. Capone had stripped that away, piece by piece. "Get it done," Tony said before turning and walking out of the office, leaving Pinkert alone with the weight of the task before him. Pinkert stood motionless for a few moments, staring at the door where Tony had exited. There was no way to escape it. Capone had a plan, and Pinkert was a part of it, whether he liked it or not. His thoughts turned inward, swirling around the consequences of failure. He had seen what Capone did to people who disappointed him. Capone didn't just destroy lives. He ruined them, crushed them completely, and used their ruin as a lesson to everyone else. Pinkert had no illusions about what would happen if he didn't follow through. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up, his hand still trembling from the conversation with Tony. The name on the screen was enough to send a jolt through his chest. It was Capone. "Harold," Capone's voice came through, calm and collected as ever. "I trust everything's moving along." "Yes, Mr. Capone," Pinkert said, his voice strained. "Tony just left and we're handling the situation." Capone's silence on the other end of the line was unnerving. "I want this dealt with quickly, Harold. I've got big plans and I need everyone to stay in line. Don't let me down." Pinkert felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had already known the stakes were high, but now they felt higher than ever. Capone's voice didn't waver, didn't show a hint of doubt. It was just another reminder that failure wasn't an option. Not anymore. "I'll make sure it's handled," Pinkert said, though his voice felt hollow. "Everything will be done the way you want." "Good," Capone replied. "Make sure of it, I'm trusting you." Line went dead. Pinkert sat there for a long moment, staring at the phone in his hand. The conversation had been brief, but the implications were clear. Capone was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. Pinkert stood up from his desk and walked to the window, looking down at the streets of Chicago. The city was bustling, oblivious to the power struggles taking place behind closed doors. But Pinkert knew the truth. It wasn't the people who lived here that had control anymore. It was Capone. And Pinkert, despite all his years in business, had become nothing more than a cog in Capone's machine. The task before him was clear, but the price was steep. Handling the situation wasn't just about keeping the business running. It was about sending a message, making sure that Capone's power was absolute. And if that meant doing things he'd never thought himself capable of, so be it. Pinkert had become a man of compromise. He had compromised his pride, his identity, and now, it seemed, he was being asked to compromise his soul. Understood. Here's the final part, bringing Harold Pinkert's story to a close. The air in the city was thick with the weight of what was happening. Chicago, a place where power and crime had always been inextricably linked, was now a stage set for the final act of a tragic story. Harold Pinkert had once been a man of distinction, a man who commanded respect. But now, as the walls of Capone's empire closed in around him, Pinkert realized that there was no escape, no redemption, and no turning back. It had been days since Tony's warning, and Pinkert had already started to feel the pressure of what Capone had asked of him. He had to handle the situation, to do whatever was necessary to keep the bank running smoothly. The weight of that responsibility, of those ominous words, had not left him for a moment. He had no choice but to comply. Disappointment, he knew, would be met with swift and brutal consequences. The situation Capone referred to was a small, but important, issue involving a rival group that had been making noise on the outskirts of Capone's territory. Capone didn't tolerate rivals who disrupted the flow of business. Capone didn't tolerate anything that might threaten his empire. Pinkert had always avoided direct involvement in the dirty work. He had been a businessman, a respectable one in his mind, managing the bank, keeping the books in order, making sure the money flowed smoothly. He had kept his distance from the violence, from the bloodshed. That had always been Capone's domain. But now he had no choice but to step into the darkness that Capone had claimed as his own. The time had come for Pinkert to deliver, to prove that he wasn't just a tool to be discarded but a servant of the empire. The thought of what he would have to do, of the decisions he would have to make, left him nauseous. But he couldn't afford hesitation. He couldn't afford weakness. The phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Capone. "Harold," Capone's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it. "I trust you've taken care of things." "I'm handling it, Mr. Capone," Pinkert replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Everything will be in order." Capone was silent for a moment, as if weighing Pinkert's words. "I need it done now, Harold. No more delays. You know what happens when things don't go according to plan. Don't make me come down there again." Pinkert's heart raced. "I understand," he said quickly. "I'll make sure it's done." Capone chuckled softly. "You've got one chance, Harold. Don't waste it." The line went dead, leaving Pinkert standing in his office, the weight of Capone's words pressing on him. He had no choice now. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and as much as he hated the man he had become, as much as he despised the position he was in, he knew there was no way out. Pinkert met with Tony and a few of Capone's men later that evening. He could see the coldness in their eyes, the absence of any empathy. They were there to ensure Capone's will was carried out, nothing more, nothing less. They made it clear that Pinkert's role in this would be minimal. He was to sign off, to give the orders, but the execution would be done by others. He stood with them, watching, knowing that his participation in this act would forever change him. The choice to be complicit was no longer his own. It had been taken from him the moment Capone had walked into his life. "Get it done," Tony ordered, his tone blunt, no room for argument. "Capone's counting on us." Pinkert nodded silently, his chest tight with the enormity of the moment. The operation was swift. Capone's men dealt with the rival group quickly and efficiently, and when the dust settled, the problem had been resolved. But the price of Pinkert's compliance was steep. He had crossed a line, one he could never come back from. The darkness that Capone lived in had now touched him, and the man who had once been a respectable banker was no more. He was now just another extension of Capone's power, an enabler of the violence, a servant in the empire that had swallowed everything Pinkert once stood for. That night, after the final transaction was completed, Pinkert sat alone in his office, staring at the same ledgers that had once defined his career. But they no longer mattered. The numbers on the page meant nothing. What had once been a testament to his hard work and intellect was now just a reminder of what he had lost. The power that Capone wielded was absolute. Pinkert had tried to deny it, to convince himself that there was a way out, but he had learned the hard way that in Capone's world there was no escaping the grip of power once it had you. There was only survival, and that survival was bought with loyalty. Pinkert's phone buzzed once more. It was Capone. "Harold," Capone's voice came through. "Good work. Things went exactly as I wanted. You did well. But just remember, Harold, you're with me now. There's no going back." Pinkert's response was automatic. "I understand, Mr. Capone." Capone's chuckle was low and cold. "I'm counting on you, Harold. You've got a good spot in this world, as long as you keep your head down and do what's asked of you." The line went dead. Pinkert put the phone down slowly, feeling the finality of Capone's words settle deep inside him. There was no future left for him. Not the future he had once imagined, not the one where he was respected, where he controlled his own destiny. Capone had won, and Pinkert, for all his ambition and hard work, had become nothing more than another man trapped in the system. A system built on power, fear, and loyalty to a man who had risen from nothing to own everything.